well imagine what we've been doing. Over.
I certainly.
If you drove an American highway in the mid-1970s, you remember the antennas. They sprouted from the trunks of station wagons and the cabs of pickup trucks like some strange new weed all across the country, almost overnight. And if you flipped one of these on, you entered another world, a world of crackling voices, secret code words, and made-up names. Breaker Breaker, 10-4, Good Buddy, What's Your 20? For a few wild years, tens of millions of ordinary Americans were talking to total strangers over the airwaves, and the whole country was swept up in it. It was called CB radio, and between about 1974 and 1977, Americans bought roughly 25 million of these sets. That is about 1 out of every 5 adults in the entire country. And then, almost as fast as it arrived, it was gone. By the early 1980s, the antennas came down, the channels went quiet, and one of the biggest fads in American history simply faded away. Now, most people, if you ask them why the CB craze died, will give you a quick answer. The cell phone came along and made it obsolete. And that is not quite right. The truth is stranger, and a little sad, because CB radio was not killed by some new invention. It was killed by the very thing that made it great. This is the story of the rise and fall of the CB radio craze, and by the end, I will show you how the most popular fad in America destroyed itself with its own success. To understand it, you have to go back further than most people think. The CB radio was not born in the 70s at all. It was invented back in 1948 by a brilliant engineer named Al Gross, the same man who had helped create the walkie-talkie. His idea was simple and, for the time, almost science fiction. A small, affordable radio that would let ordinary people talk to one another wirelessly, on the move, decades before anyone had ever dreamed of a cell phone. In 1958, the government formally set aside a slice of the airwaves for the public to use, and called it the Citizens Band. Citizens Band. That name matters, and we will come back to it. But for years, almost nobody cared. CB radio sat quietly in the background, a niche hobby for a small number of enthusiasts. For a decade and a half, it was a solution waiting for a problem. And then, in 1973, America handed it exactly the problem it needed, because that is when the CB craze truly caught fire, and it caught fire for 3 reasons that all struck at once. The first was the oil crisis. In 1973, an oil embargo hit the United States, and suddenly, gasoline was scarce and expensive. Long lines formed at filling stations, and many stations simply ran dry. And in response, the federal government imposed a nationwide speed limit of 55 miles an hour, and enforced it hard with highway patrols. For the men who drove America's highways for a living, the long-haul truckers, this was a daily nightmare. Where could you find a station that still had fuel? Where were the police running radar? There was one tool that could answer both questions instantly. The CB radio. A trucker, 20 miles ahead, could warn everyone behind him. Gas at the next exit. Or, watch out, there's a bear taking pictures up ahead. Almost overnight, the CB became essential equipment in the cab of every truck in America. The second reason was rebellion. This was the 1970s. The country had just been through Vietnam and Watergate, and trust in the government was at rock bottom. And here was the CB, a network owned by no company and controlled by no government, where the people talked directly to each other and used it to outwit the authorities and their 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. The truckers became folk heroes, modern-day cowboys thumbing their noses at the law. In December of 1973, truckers even used their CBs to organize a massive highway blockade to protest fuel prices. The CB was not just a radio anymore. It was a symbol of freedom and defiance, and that was intoxicating. And the third reason was pure pop culture. Once the craze started, Hollywood and the music industry poured gasoline on the fire. In 1975, a country singer performing under the name C.W. McCall released a song called Convoy, the tale of a band of rebel truckers barreling across the country, told entirely in CB slang. It shot straight to #1 on both the country and pop charts in January of 1976. and it turned CB lingo into a national language. Then came the movies. In 1977, Smokey and the Bandit, with Burt Reynolds, put CB culture up on the big screen and made it box office gold. There were more films and TV shows and hit songs, all celebrating the same romance of the open road and the crackle of the radio. And so the whole country jumped in. This is the part longtime enthusiasts still shake their heads about, because CB had been a trucker's tool, and now it belonged to everyone. Families bolted units into the family car for vacations. Children begged for handheld sets to talk to friends down the block. People built base stations in their living rooms with tall antennas that made the neighbors jealous. Even the First Lady of the United States, Betty Ford, got on the air and picked a handle for herself. Electronic stores could not keep the radios on the shelves. The government made it easier still, slashing the license fee from $20 down to just $4, and eventually, so many people ignored the license requirement entirely that it became unenforceable. Everyone picked a nickname, a handle, and started talking. For a few glorious years in the mid-70s, from the outside, it looked like the CB radio had permanently rewired the way Americans talked to one another. But hidden inside that explosion of popularity was the exact thing that would destroy it. And it is not what most people assume. The fall of the CB craze came from three forces, and the first two were not outside attacks at all. They were the direct result of its own success. The first was overcrowding. Here is the problem that no amount of enthusiasm could fix. The Citizens Band had only a limited number of channels, originally 23. That was plenty for a handful of hobbyists and some truckers. But it was hopelessly, catastrophically inadequate for tens of millions of users all trying to talk at once. The airwaves became a wall of noise. On any given channel, you would hear 10 conversations layered on top of each other, squeals and static and strangers shouting over one another, until you could barely make out a single word. The government tried to help by expanding the band from 23 channels to 40. It was like adding a couple of lanes to a highway during a traffic jam of 40 million cars. It did not matter. The very thing that made CB exciting, that everyone was on it, was the thing that made it unusable. A tool that only works when a few people share it does not scale to a whole nation. And so the experience got worse, precisely because it got more popular. The second force was that the rebellion lost its cool. Think back to that word, Citizens Band. The whole magic of CB was that it felt like an outlaw's secret, a private code shared by renegade truckers and people in the know. But a secret shared by 40 million people is not a secret. It is a fad. When your grandmother has a CB in her Buick, and there are novelty t-shirts, and cartoon tie-ins, and the First Lady has a handle, the outlaw mystique is gone. The very thing that had made it feel special, that it belonged to a rebellious few, evaporated the moment it belonged to everyone. What had felt like joining a rebellion started to feel like following a trend. And trends, by their nature, end. People simply got bored and moved on to the next thing, the way America always does. And the third force, the one that finally closed the door years later, was technology, but not in the way people remember. The CB did not vanish the day the cell phone arrived. Affordable mobile phones for ordinary people were still years away. But over the following decade, as the novelty wore off, and then as new technologies slowly appeared, the practical reasons to own a CB faded one by one. The economy changed, the panic over gas lines passed, and the radio that had once felt like a lifeline became just another dusty box in the garage. Because here is the truth that most people get wrong. The CB craze did not die because something better replaced it. By the early 1980s, long before the cell phone was in anyone's pocket, the fad had already collapsed on its own. It died because a private club cannot survive becoming a public mob. It died because the airwaves it depended on were a shared, limited space, and it invited the entire country to crowd into them at once. Its popularity was not the reward for its success. Its popularity was the cause of its death. And so, quietly, the antennas came down. They disappeared from the family station wagons first, then from most of the cars, until they were once again a rare sight, mostly on the big trucks that had started it all. The novelty magazines folded. The slang stopped being cool and started sounding dated. By the mid-1980s, the great CB radio craze was over, remembered as one of the strangest and most sudden fads the country had ever seen. But here's the part I love. The CB radio never actually died. It just went back to the people who had needed it in the first place. To this day, if you talk to a long-haul trucker, there is a good chance there is still a CB crackling in the cab, used for exactly what it was always best at. Real drivers, warning each other about real trouble up ahead on a long and lonely road. The craze passed, the tool remained. So what do we take from all of this? There are lessons here about fads, and about the difference between a passing trend and a lasting technology. But for me, the lesson that stays is quieter than that. The CB radio gave people something they were desperately hungry for in the 1970s. In a decade of gas lines and broken trust and a country that felt adrift, it offered a voice in the dark, the chance to reach out and hear a stranger answer back. To belong to something, to not feel so alone out there, on the highway. That is a deeply human need. And for a few years, a little box with an antenna filled it beautifully. What people were really reaching for was not the radio, it was each other. And the moment that reaching out became a mob of 40 million voices all shouting over one another, the very connection they were looking for was drowned out by the crowd chasing it. Because that is the truth these stories keep teaching us. Sometimes the thing that makes us feel like we belong to a special, secret few cannot survive everyone else discovering it too. The crowd that a movement attracts is very often the same crowd that buries it. Now I would love to hear from you. Were you on the CB back in the day? What was your handle? Do you remember a voice that answered you out there on the road? Leave a comment below and share the memory. And go ahead, sign off with your old handle if you had one. And if this story took you back, take a moment to subscribe, because here on this channel, we tell these stories one at a time. After all, every rise has its fall. 10-4, good buddy.